back to the Valley to Peak Nutrition Podcast. We are here with the follow-up to a podcast that we had just a couple of episodes ago where someone had written in about the documentary of What the Health, and we basically reviewed kind of the pros and the cons, etc., involved with that. Little did we know that it was opening Pandora's box, and we had quite a few people write in follow-up questions, whether it was directly emailed to us or it was sent to us in a direct message on one of the social media channels or whatever. It seemed to be a topic that a lot of people were really interested in. So we started getting so many of them that I felt like I would imagine that these are common questions that a lot of people might have, and it would be worth us doing a follow-up episode on. So that is what this is. We will look at that, potentially a couple of other topics. But question number 1.
In the April 6th podcast, you described the result of research indicating that certain preparations or cooking styles of meat increases the risk of colon cancer. Dumb question, does this research include only red meat or would it also include chicken? If the research doesn't cover this question, what is your current thinking on that?
That is a very good question, and I guess I'll answer it in two ways as far as like, what does the current research say? Is this applied to all animal proteins, or is this just strictly consolidated to red meat? And then I guess I'll give you my take, which is based on the research. So it does apply to all meats because the compounds that are formed are directly formed with the proteins. So when cooked with amino acids and creatine or muscle proteins, it's that it reacts to the high heat and forms the issue. The second piece that is kind of a ancillary effect is if the meat, no matter what the source, be it fish or chicken, red meat, whatever, is high in fat, the drippings from the fat increases the likelihood that there is a flame, which then exposes to an additional carcinogen. So again, like, I don't want to be an alarmist, but I think the important thing in that is it describes the mechanism by which these things cause a problem. Right. It says that it's basically the proteins within the meat that creates a lot of the heterocyclic amines, which are the main problems that we talked about last time whenever you're grilling a lot of meat all the time. And again, I would highly encourage anybody that's listening to this episode first to go back and listen to the first episode, because it's not like anytime you grill, you need to panic. It's very much about the frequency and how often. There's ways to work around it, etc. So it does apply to all meat, and that would be, the second part of the question. What's my current thinking on it is just that it really applies to any meat. And so, being aware of how you cook it, how often you cook it, how often you eat it, etc., I think is an important piece of it.
And what's the HCA stand for? Say it. I know that it ends with amines. So let's just say that the big word that ends with amines, that's not something that is like on meat and then gets activated by heat, right? Like it's something that is formed when there's direct heat on meat, or how does that work?
Yep, correct. So it's formed when meat hits it. Now, like, I'm going to bring this full circle too. This happens when you toast bread. This happens when you roast potatoes. This happens when there's a lot of different compounds that are formed on food when you cook it. And the darker that it is, the more often it's cooked, the longer it's cooked, the greater the chance that those develop, the more risk that's involved. Here's part of my point, and even why would I even include that? Unless you are going to live under a rock and never cook anything, it is going to be terribly hard to avoid all of these. And one thing that I really want to do before we get off today is, I think the overarching question that most people have is like, how do you know? Like, when is the point when it's too much? When is it not enough? What's the risk? What's the cutoff? How do you know whenever, you're getting close to that point? So I want to try to give some practical advice off of that by the time we jump off, but there's several questions here.
Is that why some people, there's many reasons for this, what I'm about to ask you, but is that why some people would eat raw meat. They think like any heat could cause this, or is I feel like this HCA means business is no one has heard of that.
I mean, I have no idea if they've been saying it for years. So if we haven't heard of it, we've either been unaware or we've been ignoring it, or maybe we didn't understand what it meant. I don't really know why. They've kind of been talking about it for a while, though. Why do people eat raw meat? I have no idea. You would have to ask them why they eat that. You want to start eating some raw meat?
I guess someone recently had said, oh, well, I know so and so that eats raw meat all the time. Like it's very intentional and not just like sushi. Like it was like raw. I assume raw meat. I don't even know. I wondered if there was any bit of that you've heard is like common concern. Like, oh, well, because I've heard of this, that's why I eat raw meat. But maybe it's totally unrelated. It just sparked that in my head.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff floating around out there now about certain things being uncooked and unaltered, having a greater nutrient density, and your body reacting to it different. And like, think back to the once famous Liver King on Instagram. He was basically eating all raw meat and all organ meat under the assumption that it's got greater nutrient density and is going to be better for you. But again, we have nothing that tells us that. We have some guy who's really, really, really big and does this. So we must think, he does this. That's probably why he's big. I'd like to look like him. Maybe I should eat raw meat. I mean, I guess that's some folks' thinking. Next question.
The next part of the question is the next question, I guess, is from my close to entirely ignorant perspective, it seems that the same concerns would apply to chicken as well as to red meat, since the mechanism has to do with the application of direct heat to animal tissue rather than the specific makeup of the animal tissue itself. But I'd be interested in knowing if I were wrong.
Yeah, I think that's the piece that we just answered, right? It was kind of rephrased. But this same person included the second part. So the second part, which is something we didn't cover.
The next part of the question says, I also assume the concern does not extend to vegetables. Think charred Brussels sprouts, my favorite, or the like, because charred veggies are, to me, quite distinct from charred tissue. But again, would love to know if I am wrong.
So, yes, the HCAs compounds do not exist in vegetables because there's no protein or creatine in vegetables for the HCA to form on. Now, it probably doesn't take a whole lot of logic to realize anytime you're charring anything and eating it is without its own risk, right? And like we were doing s'mores the other night with the boys. Well, I was out there with him. I think you were somewhere. I'm watching this marshmallow go up in an inferno with Grant trying to roast over the flame. And part of me is like, oh, just let him go. The other part's like, there's no way I'm going to let this dude eat that. So while there is no formation of certain compounds on the vegetables, it's not without entirely no risk, because you do have another compound that can form on those that are also known carcinogens. So I think the big picture takeaway here among all of this is, as often as you are able, avoid charring, searing, all of that stuff. Like, I think the thing that's most common right now within the community that we work with and listens to this, like hunting community specifically, is the reverse sear on a backstrap or a tenderloin, which is where you throw it in the oven. You sear the crud out of that thing, usually in cast iron skillet. It's that searing that we know, and that we know is not necessarily good. In fact, like when you go read the research around a lot of this stuff, they specifically call out searing in a pan as potentially being one of the worst ways to cook it. Trying to avoid just completely charring stuff all of the time, I think, is important. Now, with that said, this fall, we'll go hunting. If we are fortunate enough to be successful, I can promise you that I will reverse sear the tenderloins on whatever it is that we harvest. And I will probably do that again at some point over the year with backstraps. But I'm not nightly, we're not, every night cooking that way. the dose, like we always say about everything, is really where the poison comes in.
I sear stuff not even on purpose. I just burn things a lot when I cook, and I still eat it. So,
and look at you. You're still going strong. All right, next question.
I enjoyed your podcast on What the Health. Quick question though. It sounds like your household eats a lot of chicken. I would love to learn your red meat versus white meat versus fish breakdown per week. I know the dose is the poison, but it sounds like your white meat consumption is a lot more than red per the podcast.
It is a lot more than red because that's the only thing those two will eat, Grant and Sam. Now, they do love like ground elk or ground venison with spaghetti sauce. Recently found out they really like chili. And so they will, do some of that. But a large part of the reason that we tend to eat more white meat than red meat is just because of simplicity and versatility and because they'll eat it. Like, for example, we'll cook up several pounds of just plain chicken, and then we'll use that in quesadillas for them or nachos for them or in a wrap for them, or, we'll eat it in stir fry or fajitas. That we just use it for so many different things. It's a little harder to pull off with some red meat cuts. But I would say like the ratio, and this is not intentional, it just happens to be what I pull out every week out of the freezer. I pull out our proteins for the week, usually on Sunday, and then kind of cook them throughout the course of the week. Is we probably eat, 2 to 3 meals built around red meat, which is usually elk or venison. And we'll cook like a couple pounds of it and eat on that for lunch over the course of the week too. So the rest of it's chicken, and probably once every 2 weeks, we'll pull out some fish, which is usually salmon. Occasionally we'll have some steelhead. That's really it. I mean, if we pull out fish, it's usually salmon that we got from your folks from Alaska and Audrey.
And I think that's one, I don't know, we've noticed lately that people we know that listen to the podcast are often like, oh, so you say that I should eat more chicken then. It's like, whoa, 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 whoa. That's not what was said at all. I feel like clarifying this one specifically would be good. It's convenient. I know, even though I grew up eating red meat more than chicken, feel more comfortable preparing chicken. I don't worry about ruining it. I do worry about ruining like elk meat or something just because it's harder to come by. So, that just happens to be what our family has found convenient. It's not because it's better or worse, or we have concerns about health or something like that, because we have friends in great healthy condition who live off of fish, or their main protein is elk or deer or something. And that's just, again, that's probably just because of where we live and the hobbies that we have.
And I would say too, the way that we tend to cook a vast majority of that stuff is either, this is both convenience and because I try to take this whole topic into consideration and preparing our own meals, is we either throw it in a crock pot or we throw it in an instant pot. And so both of those methods are generally involving liquid and or pressure and or steam to cook it. There's not a lot of charring / grilling / whatever going on. Now, with that said, that's most of the time. But yeah, I will still grill chicken. I will still grill burgers. I will still grill a lot of different proteins. But yeah, we definitely eat more chicken than anything else, predominantly out of convenience and versatility for the entire family. But if I had to be honest, I want red meat at least a couple times a week.
I would probably prefer it. I would almost say daily. Like if I had to choose, I grew up eating very little chicken because we always had red meat. So I'm not trying to be critical or complain about what we eat, because for those of you that don't know, Kyle is the one that cooks in our house. I would eat some more red meat. The next question is, how do you cook your jerky if you don't use pink salts and nitrates?
So I make a marinade, and that marinade does have a lot of salt in it. And usually the salt is coming by way of garlic salt, teriyaki sauce, and soy sauce. So like I'll use a combination of those three things to marinate it in the refrigerator for, like 3 to 4 days tends to be kind of the magic amount of time for flavor development. I'm not really thinking about curing it or anything like that. And then we throw it on the smoker of the Traeger, basically try to get as much moisture out of it or to the texture that we want. And we don't really do any ground meats, right? So this method's going to be harder if you like to grind your meat and then put it through a jerky gun and get it to come out, because the seasoning of the jerky is typically some sort of a powder base, because if you get too much liquid trying to shoot that through a jerky gun, you basically just wind up with this congealed mess. It doesn't work near as much. So we usually do like whole muscle groups cut into strips, marinated it, and then we put it on the Traeger. Now, with all of that said, right, because in the previous podcast I said, well, we really try to avoid nitrates, we really try to avoid pink salts, we really try to avoid a lot of these things. Our method avoids those things, but is still not without risk, right? So if you look at, again, and I'm going to link this because someone had emailed me, like, you keep mentioning this matrix that you saw or whatever. I will link that so you can go look at it. I will tell you this though, if you decide to click and go look at it, it is a rabbit hole and it is very challenging to it's a very challenging site to navigate. It's from the World Cancer Foundation. So this is like data that we have pulled out of a lot of different people groups. This isn't just us. It is incredibly interesting, but can be really challenging to navigate. So when you look at that, it still says, like, and you look at that matrix, it still says salting meat, less than ideal. Smoking meat, less than ideal. But there is a really strong correlation with curing it, right? Especially with colorectal cancer. And so we don't eat jerky all the time. I'm not eating it all the time. If I'm going to pick and choose, then I choose this route as opposed to using any of the nitrates, etc.
What makes pink salt different than regular salt, or garlic salt, regular seasonings and things like that?
That is the sodium, that's the nitrate piece of it.
Little bit off topic, but I'll bring it back. We talked yesterday about a lot of the buzzwords that people in nutrition, both those that know what they're talking about and those that have no idea, use, or they have heard, or they're fearful of, or whatever. Nitrates, I feel like, is one of those. Like, people will say, oh, just make sure you don't have food with GMOs, but no, like, very few of us really know what that actually means. Like, what happens to make something genetically modified? Or, oh, like I said, something about saturated fat, and someone said, well, what's the difference in saturated fat? I say all those examples because I think nitrates fall in that. Can you explain what a nitrate is and why it is a concern to have them too often?
We use it to cure meats because we know that when you use that compound or you use sodium nitrate, it prevents the growth of bacteria. So the biggest fear with making jerky is that it will grow bacteria because obviously it's not sitting in a refrigerator, it's sitting in a bag on a shelf somewhere. So you need something that you know is going to kill that bacteria. We know sodium nitrate does that. We also know sugar does that. We also know salt in general does that. We also know smoking does that. We also know the removal of water does that. That's why you can dehydrate stuff and let it last forever. For me, if I'm looking at like a good, better, best paradigm, or I guess really a bad, worse, and worser paradigm, that's why I'm choosing to take the method that we do as opposed to using nitrates. Because again, when you read about nutrition, there's a lot of stuff that's like, could be this or that, might be wise to take the more conservative route, blah, blah, blah. When you read nitrates, though, it's like pretty universal. Nope, this stuff isn't great, especially if you're talking about colon cancer. Now, I think what's most interesting is the amount that you consume to meet the minimum threshold is 2 ounces on a regular basis. typical recommendation as far as consumption of these meats is to eat no more than between 350 or 500 grams of cooked red meat in a week. That's 12 to 18 ounces. And then they go on to say, as far as like processed meats that have been cured with nitrates, says consume very little, if any, processed meats, because I think there is such a strong correlation that, I'll have to look back. I'm fairly sure they even go deeper to say limit it, like the threshold is as little as 2 ounces, 2 to 3 ounces of processed meat on a weekly basis. Now, if you think about that, like your average Subway sandwich has that plus some in a 6 inch. So it really, I think, speaks to that part of it. And so even though, yes, smoking meats, and yes, using a lot of salt isn't necessarily ideal, I feel like I want to take that route if I'm going to have jerky more so than to use nitrates. What's interesting too about this matrix, this website, I don't even want to call it a website because it's a research study, but they put it in a website, obviously, is that they really pull out a couple of trends. The number one thing that drives all cancer risk up across the board is obesity. When you look at the matrix, every single type of cancer that's listed, a very high correlation to developing that, the greatest risk is obesity. Another one, alcohol intake, and then these cured meats, etc., is one of the others. As you keep looking at it, the number one thing that's preventative is fruit, vegetable, and whole grain intake. So, like, if you go back to the origin of this conversation, which was about the podcast or about the documentary of What the Health is saying red meat is killing you. That's not entirely true. We're not talking only about red meat here. We're talking about the way that you cook it. You can cook it many other ways, and you reduce all of this stuff that we're talking about, right? We are talking specifically about these things developed when you're charring meat. Outside of that, the risk is quite low. But then we also got into the topic of, I can't remember if you'd asked the question or how it came up, but the carnivore diet and the risks associated with that, etc. The interesting thing about that is that, a lot of times proponents of the carnivore diet will say plants are killing us. Not only do we have nothing that tells us that, we have quite the opposite that says plant-based foods are not only not killing us, they are literally helping us in every way. Like, they drive down every factor involved here. So again, I think it just goes back full circle to say, when it comes to nutrition, there is no panacea. There is nothing, no one thing that is a fix-all. It truly is about taking all of these things into consideration. And I know this is going to sound like we're beating a dead horse here, but it's all about the dose. You could eat too many apples and develop problems. You could eat too much meat and develop problems. You could eliminate X, Y, and Z and develop. There's so many different factors in here. So to cast this net so broadly as to say this one thing fixes everything or this one thing hurts everything is so misleading and untrue. Is the type of stuff that puts me over the edge. And so we'll just leave it at that. They don't want to hear me rant.
This could easily be a completely separate podcast, but after looking at that chart and that matrix that he refers to, and it's not some like out there like, oh, I have the matrix, like I have the formula. It's it's public, like it's very simple to understand. I guess for me, I always want to know why things work. Like, what is that in? Why is this like that and all of that? Why does obesity or overweight, I don't even know if it's just obesity, but why is that a leading, I wouldn't say cause of cancer, what a risk factor for getting cancer?
In that situation, there is inflammation at a cellular level. And I know that it's really hard to understand like what that looks like, but essentially it makes your cells respond unnaturally. Part of that unnatural response and part of like I won't even pretend to fully understand the development or growth of a cancer cell. But part of what triggers it is an abnormal cellular response. So when you look at obesity, being overweight, whatever you want to call it, we know there is basically, that is the one thing that nearly every chronic disease has in common. When that is present, the risk goes up a lot. And so I think it goes back to, I think this is like, this is not designed or meant to be a sales pitch for Valley to Peak, but that is exactly why our approach is so simple. And people will say like, well, don't you, have them follow X diet or Y diet or track this or track that or do this? And it's like, do that. It's like, no, I don't. Because if you can get an individual to lose 10% of their current body weight, if they're overweight, all of those factors improve. That's aside, you don't have to overhaul your diet. You don't have to become, a certain way of eating if you're not already that way. You don't have to start all of a sudden loving something that you hate. You don't have to do any of that. If you can get a person to lose 10% of their current weight, if they're unsatisfied with it, then nearly all of those markers improve. So if you make it simple and that allows them to be consistent, and consistency leads to progress, why would I make it harder for them?
The 10% thing sounds phony. I don't believe it is because I trust you, but it sounds phony because if you weigh, let's say 500 pounds and you lose 10%, or if you weigh 145 pounds and you lose 10%, let's just say that whether the 500 or the 145 is overweight for that individual, how can 10% be, you know what I mean?
I think a huge caveat here is the person in a state where they need to lose the weight, right? So like if you take someone, I don't want to assume any heights or any weights and assume like, oh, well, you shouldn't worry about the weights or whatever. But like, let's just use a hypothetical number. If you take someone who is a grown adult and they weigh 80 pounds and you say, wow, well, weight loss of 8 pounds will really improve your health. It's very likely that adult doesn't need to lose any weight. So there's no health improvements to be had. In fact, we could argue that they'd be in a worse spot. But if you take someone else who weighs 500 pounds, like you had said, and they lose 10% of their weight, that drops them down to 450 pounds. It's likely that they're still going to feel like they're not in a position that they necessarily want to be in. But you have to think, okay, how did you lose the weight? It's very likely that they changed their diet, right? And so it's not just indicative of a poundage loss. It's indicative of the habits that changed that produced that weight loss. And I think that's been one thing that's been so interesting over the years of this is nobody really cares about what the scale says, right? They care about what they think they get by weighing a lower weight, a better life, whether it's quantity or quality or whatever. And oftentimes we'll say, look, as hard as and as stupid as this is going to sound from me, do not focus on how much weight you lose this week. Simply focus on the habits that produce that weight loss that you think will lead to that, because you have control over those, right? And if you are doing those, it's very, very likely that you're going to get the outcomes. And so I think the 10% is, it is true, but I also think that it's more indicative of, oh, you stopped all of these poor behaviors. You began all of these great behaviors that we know improve health. And that led to the better outcome as opposed to just this arbitrary weight loss.
So it's not a magic number percentage. It's that's almost like a symptom of this positive change or healthy habits.
It is a percentage. That number is true. 10% is the number. But if you had to really press me and say, well, why do you think that is? It would have to be that because the number's arbitrary, right? I would guess that, that 10% mark is a sizable enough change to produce a different outcome. But again, I think like if you critically think about this, the overarching theme is they've changed their habits. For someone to lose 10% of their weight, they didn't just go out and, you know, start drinking a protein shake at lunch and nothing else changed. They've probably changed a number of habits that led to, over time, a sizable enough change that really produced a lot of these different outcomes. Now, you take that same person, would 20% be better? 30% be better? Could be. It's going to depend on where that person begins, the amount of weight that they, feel like they need to lose. To really quantify, like, okay, well, what's the percentage at which I arrive at the, most optimal, whatever. I think the point is that your habits and changes over time really add up. And, when I worked at the hospital, I won't even say the specialty, I would get a certain specialty refer patients to me. And they always wanted these patients to fall within the BMI charts, which meant that for a lot of them, they needed to lose upwards of 80 to 100 pounds. And a lot of these folks were older, 70, 80. And so for them, it's like, I'm never going to do that in my lifetime. And so I would say, great, what about 10%? And so if you had someone who weighed 225 pounds, 250 pounds, it's like, I could do 20, I could do 25. So now all of a sudden they go from thinking, I'm not even going to try it because the number's so asinine, that I actually feel like I could do 22 to 25. And if you can get them to do that, lo and behold, things get better. And now they don't need said specialty or surgery or whatever, because the markers improved. And it was interesting and eye-opening to see, because it really changed the way I viewed what needs to happen for someone, and like between, the difference between optimal and practical and what's really most realistic for someone. Next and final.
This person says, I just listened to the latest episode and would love to hear a podcast on what you guys do with your wild game, how you commonly eat it and process it. We do a lot of broth and summer sausage. If we are trying to avoid bad fat, what are the best ways to use wild game?
All right. So first, I'm going to speak to this not about the bad fat piece. To me, it would be more broths and summer sausages generally use nitrates, especially if you're taking it to a butcher. That would be the bigger concern to me than the bad fats, although I love me a good broth. I will say this. In that same matrix and in that same study, they pulled out that one of the most risky proteins to use would be to broil under an oven, right? Close high heat, spare ribs. And the reason they identified that was because of the saturated fat content in the spare ribs, the constant dripping, and the effects that can cause as an increased risk. So for whatever reason, like of all the cuts of meat, I found that to be really interesting.
I don't know much about spare ribs. So the constant dripping of what is a concern?
Fat.
Well, if it's dripping off, isn't that a good place for it to go? Is off of the meat, or is that not what happened?
It's a good place for it to go because you don't maybe not want the calories, or maybe you don't want the fat intake. But like the dripping of the fat will increase the smoke content, whether that's in the oven or on a grill. If it's on a grill, then it's spurring on greater flames, which thereby causes another known carcinogen. Right. So I think that is, the greater thinking of it, which again goes back to my comment from the last episode of why I like a pellet grill, because that fat dripping off hits the pan, and although it may generate smoke, it's not causing an increased flame and thereby charring the meat. So to speak to his other question, which was, how do we process our wild game? We grind it. We grind a lot of it. What?
I really appreciate the listeners that say, how do you all, or how does your family? We do not prepare the meat. I have nothing to do with it other than I like to write with the Sharpie and write Q notes on the packages. So how Kyle prepares the meat is what he's about to tell you.
I grind it. I grind a lot of it. Now I do. So, like obviously with the back straps, I will trim those up and package those, and we'll eat those. And most often we will do those, like I said earlier, in a cast iron skillet. We will occasionally throw those on like a Traeger or just put it on a grill, but for the most part, we eat those. Look, I'm telling you all this, but I love a reverse seared back strap. Like that's just the reality of it. But with the rest of it, we are cutting it into. So we'll just break down whole muscle groups, right? Like I'll break down the sirloin and the top loin, and we'll cut steaks out of it, and we'll cut ossobuco off of the lower shank, and then we grind the vast majority of it. Now, here's what I think is, maybe the most another important piece of this. For a lot of the steaks, I create a marinade, and then when I go to grill it, I leave that marinade on. We know that marinating the meat protects the meat and reduces the risk that we're talking about here. So that's one reason that I will do that. We do a lot of whole muscle groups braised in a liquid, which we talked about last time, significantly reduces the risks associated with the development of those amines on the outside of the meat. We do a lot of ground meat. Now, I make a lot of hamburgers. In fact, if you were to ask me what I want my last meal to be, it would probably be just a really, really good burger. But we will also make tacos, and we will also make spaghetti, and we will also make chili, and we will also make all of these things that are cooked in a liquid. So I'm not searing meat all of the time and giving that, to us like as burgers or whatever. So we break it down in the traditional format. We don't make any brats, any salamis, anything really like that at all. And truth be told, a large reason why is because like by the time I get done hunting and I process all the meat, I don't want to deal with it, and I'm too cheap to take it to a butcher. So we tend to just do things that are pretty simple. And honestly, for the boys and for us, that's just what works the best. Although I will tell you, those two have developed a deep, deep, deep affinity for kielbasa. So I'm going to have to, I don't know, I got to figure that one out. But that is, that's how we process a lot of our meat. So what's the big takeaway here? I think, again, like I commented on it earlier, I don't think there's specific ratios that you should be aiming for. I don't think that you should be worrying about it. I don't think that if you show up to a barbecue and your neighbor is providing hot dogs that are black and happen to also have burgers that have been grilled, you should say, no, thank you, pass me the hummus. I don't think any of those things are true. But I do think that it's worth paying attention to. And I do think that it's worth considering, how you cook things over the course of a year, and really reducing your risks by way of that. It's funny, common sense, I think, always prevails, right? And it's been interesting for you and I to have outside conversations outside of this podcast and saying, like, at what point did we start getting so crazy and chasing all of these things? And I don't know the answer to that. But when you actually go through and you read a lot of these studies, in spite of all of these really great, cool, popular theories that are popping up all over social media, none of them are without their own set of risks, right? And general logic is still going to prevail. Fruits and veggies and whole grains, as far as we know, are still extremely valuable for our health and prevent a lot of problems. Too much of anything isn't a good thing, but it doesn't mean that you need to avoid red meat either. So I think, keep portions in moderation. Be considerate in how you cook it. Don't overdo anything in terms of frequency or dose. Don't follow this new trend of like avoiding all vegetables because they're killing us. They are not killing us. We have nothing that tells us that. In fact, we have, like I said earlier, the opposite now. If you feel better, on carnivore, it has changed your life, I will never argue with you that you should stop. If you feel better, that is what you should follow, regardless of what the evidence says. But you cannot say that these things are killing us because we have nothing that tells us that. So I think, again, general wisdom prevails, and you probably have a good idea of what that looks like. Anything you want to add? All right. Thanks for joining us. If you guys ever have any questions, you can send those to us at info@v2pnutrition.com. We would be happy to cover them. We love covering them more than we love coming up with our own ideas, and we appreciate you guys joining us. We'll talk to you again soon. Thanks for listening, everyone, and a big thanks to everyone who wrote questions in. I hope that was helpful. As always, you can send me an email if you've got other questions or need some further clarification. I wanted to make you guys aware of a couple of other things that we have coming, just on the chance that you might be interested. One is we have our third Foundations Plus cohorts. We're in the middle of one right now. We just wrapped one up at the end of March. And if you're interested in that or enrolling in that, you can do that on the website. I'll link it as well in the show notes. Number two, I'd referenced this in the recap of the rim to rim to rim that Mark and I did, but we just created and put on the website a new guide on how to fuel whenever you don't feel like it. So it walks you through what happens, how to combat it, and then some tips and strategies to deal with it when it does hit, well, like it did me on the Grand Canyon rim to rim to rim. That is also in the website, so I'll link that if you're interested in that. Third, and finally, we have some cool stuff coming up in May. We have a series of a couple of podcasts that we actually recorded in the fall, as well as an article that will go with those podcasts. And as always, like, our aim is to give you things that will actually be helpful, not just information. So that will all be coming out in May. If you don't already subscribe to the podcast, you may want to hit the subscribe button if you don't want to miss those, or you can always subscribe to the newsletter, because that kind of gives you access and a heads up on everything that is to come. There's some other stuff coming that I can't mention quite yet, but very exciting stuff as well. As always, thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. We appreciate you guys so much. Have a great rest of the week, everyone.